This is for you. Thank you. It's Halloween soon. I know.
I know too, Dorothy. And to celebrate, I wanted to talk about one of my most favorite, unintentionally horrifying movies today. The 1985 Disney film Return to Oz is perhaps the second most famous film based upon the Oz books by L. Frank Baum, right after the iconic 1939 musical film The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland. Like with the 1939 film, plenty went wrong behind the scenes on Return to Oz. The production was originally supposed to film on location in places like the Sahara Desert, Sardinia, and Spain. But Disney, who'd only greenlit the film because they were looking to use the Oz books they'd bought the copyright to decades before, were displeased with the film's ballooning budget, and the production was consequently confined to filming solely in London. The film's director, famed The Godfather and Apocalypse Now editor Walter Murch, who hadn't directed a film before and hasn't directed one since, was fired only to be rehired 5 days later after George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Francis Ford Coppola stood up for him. 9-year-old Fairuza Balk, who played Dorothy Gale, the role made famous by Judy Garland, passed out from the hot studio lights on the set of the mirrored throne room in the Emerald City. And all around, achieving the film's special effects and complicated puppetry proved to be an arduous task. When all was said and done, Return to Oz was largely a commercial and critical failure. It was a difficult film to market, being a dark fantasy that was completely different from what general audiences knew of Oz, from the nearly universally known and universally loved 1939 film. A lot of promotional material prominently displays the characters of the Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, and Cowardly Lion, even though they aren't main players in the film like they were in The Wizard of Oz. This Blu-ray cover goes as far as to include a rainbow, presumably in reference to the famous song Over the Rainbow from the 1939 film. The marketing really tries to trick you into thinking you're in for a similar experience to The Wizard of Oz, but this is hardly the case. In Return to Oz, we are treated to unnecessary and ineffective electro-shock therapy, terrifying humanoids with wheels for hands and feet, head-swapping witches, and demonic-looking gnomes. Even Dorothy's friends look a little creepy themselves. David Kerr of the Chicago Reader called the film bleak, creepy, and occasionally terrifying, which I can't argue with. But perhaps that's why the film became a cult classic and has so much allure, being not at all what one might expect. Unbeknownst to many, though, the film could have been quite a bit darker, and today, I want to talk about certain deleted elements that were cut to soften the film up, at least a little bit. In the film, Dorothy is taken to the clinic of Dr. Worley, an electroshock therapist, who means to use a machine on Dorothy to smooth out her scrambled neurons, as he believes her experience from the events of The Wizard of Oz are mere hallucinations. Dorothy sits down and talks to Dr. Worley about how the Tin Woodman came to be made of tin.
The Tin Woodsman used to be made of flesh, like everybody else. But then he cut off his leg. He had a tin leg made, but then a witch enchanted his axe, and he kept on cutting off all the other parts of his body until it was all made of tin. Even his head was...
That's all right, Dorothy.
If you listen closely, you can hear Dorothy beginning to say he hacked all the limbs off his body. But she stops herself, or the footage and or audio were spliced together, and says cut instead, because the studio felt the word hack was a bit too violent. Dorothy's explanation of how the Tin Woodman came to be can be found in L. Frank Baum's original novel of The Wizard of Oz, wherein the Wicked Witch of the East does indeed enchant his axe, so he cuts off all his body parts and needs 10 replacements. The film's ending, it appears, originally included a bit more than what appears in the final product. In the 7th draft of the screenplay, as well as the novelization, Aunt Em and Dorothy talk about the girl Dorothy met at the clinic and how it's a shame she was never found after she and Dorothy were washed away in a river during a storm while fleeing the asylum. Perhaps this was cut because its implications are a bit ambiguous. Were the girl and Ozma, the good imprisoned princess Dorothy meets in Oz, one and the same? Has she not been found in Kansas because she is, in fact, in Oz? Or was the girl a counterpart to Ozma, in the same way Dr. Worley is a counterpart to the Gnome King, and Nurse Wilson is a counterpart to Mombi? It's not exactly clear. But in such an already bleak film, do we really need even the possibility of a child drowning, brought up during what is otherwise a pretty happy ending? Probably not, as Murch, or more likely the higher-ups at Disney, thought. Aunt Em also mentions that Worley had damaged patients locked up in the clinic's basement. Now, this was mentioned before in a throwaway line by the girl Dorothy meets at the clinic when she rescues her.
Who's there? Shh! Quick! We have to get you out of here. What's that? Screaming.
There are patients who've been damaged, locked in the cellar. Quick!
But the fact that Aunt Em mentions it after having spoken to the police confirms that this indeed was happening at the clinic. In the final film, it might be that the girl at the clinic was mistaken in her fright. Perhaps that's why they leave out Aunt Em confirming the existence of the trapped, damaged patients, although they still show Nurse Wilson being carted away to jail, presumably for medical malpractice. Finally, and this is probably the darkest dropped element from the film, after the Emerald City has been restored from the desolation wrought by the Gnome King, and Ozma is freed from Mombi's enslavement, it is explained that Ozma's father was King Pastoria of Oz before the wizard came. It is said in both the 7th draft of the screenplay and the novelization that Pastoria killed himself out of remorse after selling Ozma to Mombi for a potion that granted eternal life. This is one dark part of the film that isn't from the books, where the wizard stole the throne from Pastoria, along with the baby Ozma, and simply gave her to Mombi to hide. The film's darkness has often been defended as being closer to the books, although the books never really got this dark. As much as I think Siskel and Ebert's roast of the movie is a tad unfair, Siskel does correctly note that the movie makes changes to the books, even though it's supposedly supposed to be more faithful. It appears Murch interpreted Baum's fairly dark material as darker than it had originally been. Ultimately, the detail of Pastoria's suicide was cut, and though Disney is known for content that isn't as innocent as their brand lets on, you'll very rarely ever see suicide in a Disney film. The only example that comes immediately to mind is Zira letting go of a cliff in Lion King 2 rather than accept Nala's help, and that scene ended up revised anyway, so it appears she falls accidentally. And then there's Mr. Incredible saving someone who didn't want to be saved in The Incredibles. Otherwise, Disney doesn't touch suicide, but Return to Oz dared to go there, or at least tried to. Thank you all for watching. Return to Oz is one of my favorite films, and I hope you learned some interesting new facts about it. Enjoy your spooky season. Try not to get locked in a cellar by a mad doctor. Keep following that yellow brick road. And don't get scared out of sorts.